Welcome back, and welcome to the last lecture of this course. This is week 6, lecture 2, with the title The End of Toleration, the Impact of the Reformation. And here, what I'm trying to do here is kind of wrap everything up. The majority of the content of this course, so to speak, I've already addressed in the lectures, even given the, let's say, a very abbreviated time that we've had this summer. So I certainly haven't lectured on everything. The textbook covers far more than I even attempt to in the lectures. But what I've tried to do in the lectures is offer perspective concepts, not only implicitly commenting on the textbook, but also providing how I put things together. And in some ways, since this is my course, that is important too. History is not simply pieces of information. And I've stressed throughout, in so many ways, that our concepts, as reflected in the very terms that we use to describe things, affect our understanding. And so the question almost becomes whether understanding of something, whatever it might be, has more to do with our own minds and how we conceive of reality, so to speak, than it does with reality itself. Now, again, this is getting to issues that I discuss in great detail in my On History. But it's something to keep in mind in terms of this concept of the Reformation. And I have tried to implicitly, sometimes explicitly critique my sense of common perceptions that are out there. In general, and that often are even taught as such, especially at lower levels of education in high school. If you come across the Reformation in high school, often what is being presented in more popular representations and portrayals, and then also in confessional portrayals. And we started out talking about some of the distinctions between the history of theology and historical theology. I'm not going to go back and rehash all of those or try to summarize the discussions, which I thought were very, very good. And in general, I think the discussions have been very, very good. But there is certainly a place for historical theology, but it is in theology, not so much in history. Now, again, I would argue theologically that theology should be based on history rather than the historical theology, but that's another issue. And again, I'm still be happy to talk with anybody or chat with anybody about some of these distinctions, even after the terms of the course. So this is not to say that once you submit your final exam, you never have the right to contact me and say, can we talk about this? I'm always open and happy to talk about things as we go through. But anyway, the whole point of this is that this course has tried to offer new perspective on what has been called the Reformation, because how we conceive of things affects how we understand things, and how we understand things affects how we treat other people, how we treat reality, what's out there, what we think about ourselves and our own ideas. And in some ways, it's the whole ball game. It's what it's all about, is how we understand the world in which we find ourselves. And since Christianity, regardless of your views of it, Christianity is still a very important world religion, in some ways, especially in the United States. How we approach it, what we understand by it, how do we come to an understanding of how there can be different positions and different understandings in the popular press and the media. There are times where it's like, what? This is being called the Christian perspective. Is that really the Christian perspective? Is there a Christian perspective? And the same applies to the Reformation, because that's kind of part of the same thing. So, in one sense, this course is important, I would argue, because it's still relevant today in terms of common understandings of the backgrounds to events that are happening today, and conflicts and discussions that are happening today. Um, but it's also very central, I would argue, to understand what happened How did we go from one paradigm, namely the Middle Ages, to something that has been labeled as early modern and then on into modern time? Somehow, the past is a continuum. And anytime we choose to find a starting point to discuss and an ending point, those are both artificial. We can almost go all the way back, and we have to go all the way forward to where we are today in some ways to really get the whole grasp of how things all fit together. And theologically, I would argue that we won't really understand how everything fits together until the very end, so to speak, when there is no more history, when we can look with hindsight not only this 2020, but of the entire scope. Or if we take the other position that that this world is all there is, and it doesn't really matter anyway. Um, but it does matter, even if we take that position of this is all there is. That understanding what's going on now and understanding what had transpired in the past. So this course for me is in some ways primarily conceptual. That is not to mean that the details are not important, and they are. And that's what I hope you've seen and stressed, not only in the lectures as well, in terms of talking about individual texts and individual figures and going sometimes into great detail about some of their thoughts and their positions. But also in terms of getting towards the final, which is conceptual, but the detail that is there. Because we have concepts, they're concepts of something. And if we don't put the detail and the specifics, the evidence that is there, that it still exists, together with the concepts, we just have concepts and then just like that's made up. We could just fantasize in our heads. What's the basis of claiming that something I might say about the Reformation is simply a figment of my own imagination I just make up? And so without the evidence, without the detail, the texts, the documents, the artifacts that are there, we're just wallowing in fantasy or hallucination, whatever you want to call it. And then there's no basis for saying that is not a valid position to hold. If we want to argue that Luther began something completely new, on what basis do we do that? This has to be based on the evidence. And when we look at the evidence, we can compare some of the statements that Luther makes early on with statements that have been made previously with extant texts. And we say, no, what he's saying here is not new because it had already been said, even if it was new to him. Or it's new, but in a different context. I mean, it's all these distinctions and nuances that shape our understanding of the historical development. Now, that being all said, here I want to kind of take a step back again, like maybe saying that that's what you've been doing since you first started this lecture, is taking a step back. But to look at this course overall and where we have been, and pointing towards your final exam and what I'm hoping you will deal with in your final exam, at least my expectations and my intent for the exam, which I'll do at the very end. But we need to see the plurality of differences. This Reformation was not one thing. It was not even really one period of history. We often refer to it as that. The Reformation is a period. The course is titled The Reformation. We have the Middle Ages. We have the Reformation. We have early modern Europe. We have modern Europe. And historians do this all the time, almost necessarily. We make give these labels to chronological development. And then we start taking those labels as the thing themselves. What is it? Now, your textbook, Lindbergh's book, has the title, the European Reformations in the plural, and that's very, very good because it points to not everything was the same. We can't even say that it all started with Luther necessarily, and then it's just reactions to and breaking off from. But the point I want to get at here too, with my term, the Reformation of the late Middle Ages, is because that has been so entrenched in scholarship. This distinction that the Reformation begins something new and important. It begins modernity. It begins individuality. It begins toleration. It begins, the separation of church and state. It overthrows the tyranny that was the papal church and edifice. People could all of a sudden have the freedom to think on their own, and all these different things, which aren't historically not viable because the evidence contradicts those conceptions. And so my whole term with the Reformation of the later Middle Ages is to say this period that was seen as reform it's more than that. We're lessening the urgency that was seen at the time. And then we have to ask kind of the question, after all these developments, and so what? What difference did it make? What did it really lead to? And that's what I want to look at here. So that's with the title of this course, The End of Toleration, explicitly formulated against the position of everything starts in the Renaissance and Reformation that is modern and good, and we have the beginnings of toleration, of diversity and plurality. Plurality, yes, but not necessarily accepted plurality. So we argued in terms of the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. That was, quote unquote, plurality in that there were now two legal religious confessions within the empire. But that didn't mean that there was a toleration of both. There was on the legal structure, but not within the individual principalities and states. If you were Protestant, that is Lutheran. If you were a Lutheran state, you certainly did not tolerate Catholicism. If you were a Catholic state, a Roman Catholic state, you certainly would not tolerate Protestantism. I mean, Protestant state, you wouldn't tolerate Catholicism. So it is diversity without toleration. It does not mean that there is freedom. This idea that Luther advocated that everyone could read the Bible for themselves and just interpret it their own way, and that was all well and good, was absolutely the opposite of what Luther was arguing. He was arguing that, yes, instead of using the medieval theological tradition to help us understand Scripture, it's only Scripture alone that can serve as the basis of theological debate, which in some ways was the basic position all along, that the interpretation, the literal interpretation of the Scripture was the foundation of theological positions and theological debate. Now, the other aspect is, okay, to what extent did they really follow that? That's a different question. And I'm not saying that Luther's emphasis on Scripture was simply what had always been the case, but the issue is one of authority. Because, as I tried to stress, Luther really established himself as the authority for interpreting Scripture, as opposed to the Pope being the final arbiter by means of theologians, university academic theologians. And if there was an issue that could not be settled, it went to the Pope, kind of as a final supreme judge court. But what do you do when you get rid of that? What do you do, and how do you structure things when you remove yourself from that ultimate seat of authority? It then becomes an issue for who has the authority, because debates and conflicts will always emerge. And in some ways, that's what we see throughout the 16th century, is a continued diversification or plurification of interpretations in terms of what was the truth and where was the authority to support those different positions. And within that too, it's not always simply a pure thing of we were trying to know exactly what the truth of the Scriptures are. It was also very much of politically, hey, this is an idea that can help us. So it becomes very entwined and intermeshed with all kinds of different motivations to understand really what was going forward. Now, if you take the position that theology is just illusion and a means of controlling the masses, and that we shouldn't even deal with it because it's just kind of hooey anyway, you're not going to understand what was going on in the 16th century if we can't understand the theological issues involved. Yet, on the other hand, if we simply say that this is a matter of the triumph of theological truth, we're going to miss all the other dimensions of motivations, of factors, of contributing um, dynamics that led to this transformation. Because however you look at it, if we look at Europe in 1300, it's very different from Europe in 1600. And the question is, how do we get from point A to point B, which is in some ways the basic historical question for all of history. And the complexity, though, of that is, I would say, almost mind-boggling because it is so complex trying to answer that. How do we get from point A to point B? How do we determine what point A is to begin with and what point B is to begin with before we even talk about how do we get from point A to point B? Anyway, this is all, again, on a meta level, so to speak. Whew, okay. I hope I've placed this all enough in context of where we've been and where we're going today. This all means. But what we see as we look at the, let's say, the outcomes of the Reformation movements, the various Reformations, late medieval Reformation, Luther's Reformation. And I started talking about, I said the patterns of Reformation, but then I admitted that is a poor term because, in my view, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and Luther's Reformation were both two patterns of Reformation, as well as then, the Calvinist tradition, the Zwinglian tradition, Calvinist tradition. Even though I didn't talk much about it, I did talk about it some last lecture. The English Reformation, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. These are all various patterns of Reformation. But I then talked about the denominalization. Now, I don't know when the term denomination first arose within the history of Christianity. It was not in the 16th century, to my knowledge, whatsoever. But that's in some ways realizing that is a kind of an ahistorical term. It kind of fits in some ways with what we see because it's the splintering and the increasing diversification of confessions, religious, theological, political positions that we see as a result of Luther's, and the political, not just Luther's case, which was a political case as much as it was a theological case, over against the papal case. And once let's say the lid of papal authority was thrown off, it allowed various strands and dynamics to express themselves more openly and freely, even though there's conflict. And this is not to say that before that there was simple one uniform position that simply adhered to the Pope and the papacy. I hope that is clear coming throughout all of this. That was definitely not the way the Middle Ages were in any way, shape, or form. There was conflict and everything else. I often made the analogy with medieval Christendom to a family. And I'm not assuming anything about any particular family organization or structure, but I think this analogy can work regardless of what your family background was or is, even if your family was being brought up by a state institution or orphanage or in foster homes. You don't know who your parents was. Your family is where we were raised. Whoever raised us, whether on the streets, wherever, your family is that kind of context. But within a family, there's often conflicts. I didn't have any brothers, but I had friends who had brothers. I fought with my sister. There certainly was all kinds of conflicts with my sister. There was conflicts between my parents and me. It was not necessarily always this one happy, united, harmonious group. And then with brothers, I heard, brothers fighting brothers extremely violently. I was shocked by it. I knew my fights with my sister, but they didn't go into fist fights. They didn't go into almost stabbings. Kids in high school, in elementary school, a couple brothers, they got in a fight, and one of them stuck an ice pick through the foot of the other one. These are kids, right? They're survived, but I was shocked by that. But my point is, within a family, there's still controversy, conflicts, fights, and yet, as I know from my elementary school, going back with brothers that were there, if someone started attacking a brother, the other brother, doesn't matter if they would beat up on their own brother, they would come to their defense because that's part of the family. The family, internally, we can be fights and arguments within the family, but if anything external to it attacks the family or one of the members of the family unites to support the whole family as a group. And in some ways, that was what Christendom was like. It was a family. And what we see in the course of the 16th century is that family structure of Christendom disintegrates. And what takes its place is a shift, let's say, of family identity. Rather than Christendom, it is then the nation state. And that is why I refer to it as the shift from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. That's what we're looking at. This transformation whereby, God was still there with the Reformation. In 1300, everybody, except for the Jews, of course, everybody within Christendom knew without question, that was never an issue, that God was the head of the church, and the church being synonymous with everything, the communion of believers. The question was, again, as I said, it's not an issue, conflict of church and state. It's an issue of ecclesiastical power and lay power, and who was really responsible for making the determinations for Christendom. God was in charge, but then that can be kind of problematic because God really. This is not so much a theological statement, but the Pope was seen as the vicar of Christ. Vicar is someone who rules in place of, because Christ was in heaven. We could have mystical revelations of what Jesus was telling us, but in terms of practical reality, who then speaks for God in terms of ruling Christendom? In 1600, everybody agreed that God was the head of everything. God was the head of the state. But whereas with Christendom, God was the head of Christendom, by the end of the 16th century, God is the head of nation states. And then eventually in the 16th, 17th century, into the 18th century, God gets kicked above. And it's like, God is the head. It's still so remote that it's almost irrelevant. That gets into other developments. But one of the aspects of this transformation from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state that we've seen and gone through is also a shift that I've talked about from religionization to Christianization or to confessionalization. And that's why I pointed to last lecture, the previous lecture, that I would be talking more about confessionalization today, because we really see, again, as an outcome and as a result of these Reformation movements, a shift towards a position of entrenchment. And confessionalization, which is not my term. I think I mentioned maybe already that a couple of Germans put it together in the 1980s, Heinz Schilling being one of them, of confessional Europe. And what we have is this political division based on religious confession. Now, if we look to the first slide here, or actually the second slide, but the first slide after the introduction, it was titled Confessionalization. There is a definition I give to you there. Confessionalization, a definition. The process or processes by which a particular religious confession was enforced within a given political entity as a means of territorial state building. Now, if we look at what was going on in the empire, we have the Confession of Augsburg, 1530, the Deed of Augsburg. That was what the Protestant territories, cities, and princes had put forward as this is our platform, and this is what we're willing to defend. And the Imperial Reichstag said no. The Emperor says no. That led to civil war. And that brought the whole period I talked about last lecture, I believe it was, that brought us to the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, when Charles V realized this is not going to work. And the compromise, so to speak, was worked out of the religion of the prince would be the religion of the territory. I talked about that last time, which is not to say that it's all okay. It's saying that the prince, the leader, the political leader, basically his religion would determine the religion of the state. Based on a religious confession. In this case, the Confession of Augsburg, and by 1555, something that was going on at the time that was to lead to this solution, what would be the decrees of the Council of Trent and other confessional documents. Because we have this period of confessions, the Confession of Augsburg, the Four Cities Confession, and there were others that were developed. And articles, the Schleitheim articles, have been seen kind of as a confessional doctrine for the Anabaptists. But it's a period of saying, here is our stated platform, and we have a political base for it. I know I'm just repeating myself here. But my point here is not an open of toleration and a separation of church and state in any way, shape, or form. Theology and politics had gone together from the very beginnings and foundations of Christendom, going all the way back to the Christianization of Rome. They were one and the same. One and the same. It does not mean that every prince was all that thrilled or interested or could even care that much about some of the theological intricacies. But every prince realized and knew and desired that we have to get it right, let the theologians determine what's right, and then we'll put it forward for their territory. People still believed in heaven and hell. There's no such of a secular state arising anytime soon. That is a development for the future, not for a couple more centuries. But it's an issue of, okay, things are beginning to change. Should we continue to kill people? And that Sebastian Castellio pointed out when Calvin burned Servetus. He says, to kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but is simply to kill a man. That was such a minority opinion, because heretics were seen as cancers. Heretics were seen as cancers. We still today kill people. We could formulate things as, to kill a criminal is not to defend the safety of the republic. It's simply to kill a person. We should think about that for a moment. But the issue comes about was that if we don't understand the convictions of the time, we're not going to understand the time. And theology and politics go hand in hand. And religious and political conformity was the goal. That's what we saw or see with the Peace of Augsburg and the Empire, the religious conformity with each of the given principalities that comprised the Empire, which was the Confederation of States. If you're a Catholic, there has to be conformity within your territory. If you're Protestant, there has to be conformity within your territory, even though within the Empire, there were two confessions that were allowed. How do we ensure conformity? How do we make sure that, now that we are really in control, we princes and kings and stuff, now that we're really in control, how do we enforce conformity? In the French context, It became, Calvin's ecclesiastical ordinances and Calvin's institutes became kind of confessional documents. The outcome solution there didn't come about till the end of the century with the Edict of Nantes, where there is an issue of toleration, even in that, even when Henry IV converts back to Catholicism and becomes king, acknowledged king, he'll say, okay, Huguenots, you can practice there, but not in Paris. It was not saying that one is equal to the other. It was an acceptance. It was a plurality. It was not necessarily toleration. We weren't going to be killing each other for the time being any longer over religious beliefs, but you better stay in your given designated areas, and then we're fine. Okay. In England, compromise, talking about the Elizabethan compromise. Yeah, it was a compromise between the more Marian Catholic faction and the more Calvinistic, let's say, Edwardian faction. But it wasn't a real compromise. I think I mentioned the persecution of Catholics in England at the time because this is the state church. It has to be that way. We're seeing the period of the rise of state churches as the primary form of Christianity in Europe going forward. And as a state church, that means that the religious expression is part of the state, is a political entity itself. Thomas Hobbes, which I'll mention in a bit, writing in the context of the English Civil War, said, you can believe whatever you want to believe. Freedom of conscience is absolute. You can believe whatever you want to believe here in England, but you have to follow externally the government dictated religion. Doesn't matter what you believe, you have to follow it and accept it. Because diversity can't be allowed. You can't undermine the state like that. That's where there's issues with the Puritans that kind of led to the Civil War, and we know some of these issues. So these different outcomes, as I have another slide to talk about that in a second, were not, again, openness. It was not acceptance. It was state churches who were trying to enforce conformity. And how do you go about enforcing conformity? That means you have to have an increased level of control. It's one thing to say, as a prince, I am responsible for the theological well-being, the spiritual well-being, and physical well-being of my people. It's another thing to say, now I'm not the head of the church here in Saxony, but I'm responsible for it, not just for, in a general sense, that we have the best religious life here, but that everybody is following it. There becomes an increase in the responsibility of the state. How do we go about ensuring it? And here I have on this slide confessionalization after religious political conformity, from visitations to state control. Visitations were the means that Luther started to say, okay, let's see how the Reformation message is getting across. Let's see how we're, almost hopeful of, in Luther's view, how successful has the Holy Spirit been in transforming people's lives in terms of what they know and how they're living. And the visitations in 1527 came back with shocking reports for Luther. It's like, how can this be? How can this be? People still aren't getting it. We know the truth now. People aren't following it. That's where he led to his catechism, an instrument to inculcate and ensure correct belief. Visitations. Now, Luther's visitations didn't come out of his own head. It wasn't like, all of a sudden it's like, how do we measure how we're doing here? Oh, we'll have visitations. We'll go around, send people to visit people to see what they know. That was from the monastic background, because in the monastic context, there already were visitations. Attempts to say, okay, we need to see how our policies are being followed. How is our religious life being followed? Because a monastic order was very much like that. It was an attempt to control and ensure conformity on an international scale based on administrative divisions, and on we go. So when Luther institutes the visitations, that's just adopting what he already knew, which he had also participated in as an observant Augustinian friar. But now it takes on a different context. And from visitations, that just continues. And then it is, and we need to make sure that the instruments of state control are there, that we enforce these things, that the catechism is being taught, that the proper administration of the sacraments are being followed, that the morals are being followed. Now, in Calvin's Geneva, that was kind of clear with consistory. They didn't have to worry so much about visitations because they already had the instruments in place of the consistory being kind of synonymous with the small council, and let's say spies being all around. So you hear about it, you report it back, and all those kinds of things. Well, if you take Geneva and put that into a larger state context, visitations become part of those means. And that means increased bureaucracy, increased reporting because things are delegated. And we see the growth of the bureaucratic state in terms of state control. And it could go down all the way down to the local level. And I have up here the city or state is a great monastery. That concept was already there. Erasmus makes that concept. What is a city other than a great monastery? So there's this real outgrowth from the late medieval Reformation and that monastic context of the observant movements of trying to bring about a Reformation that began to, one image I don't really like that much, but it's been used, actually by, again, Heiko, my teacher, spill over the cloister's walls to society at large. So that what had been an issue for a monastic order became an issue for a city or a state territory. And that leads to control. There have been instruments of control within the monastic world. Those then become secularized, i.e., made part of the world rather than the clerical world or the ecclesiastical in this life, and applied to ensure religious conformity as such. So in that sense of expanded state control, expanded bureaucracy, rather than blossoming or even the beginnings of individual freedom and toleration, we are beginning to see a decrease, a clamping down on individual expressions and individual liberties and freedoms, and openness and toleration. That's what comes about in the later part of the 16th century and on into the 17th century and beyond in terms of confessionalized Europe, when the principle for that conformity was a given religious confession or confessional documents like the decrees of the Council of Trent and so on. Now, when we go then to say, okay, given all of that, what does that have to do with the myth of the nation state? How do we get from confessionalization to the myth of the nation state? Because the nation state became the locus of authority for that state control and conformity. What was a loose umbrella of medieval Christendom became increasingly restricted to individual principalities. Therefore, the level of control increased. And the state, the nation state, began to be seen as that authority. The authority. Now, it's a myth because there is no such thing as a nation state, really. We can't put a nation state on the table and examine it. We can't put, France in 1600, and let's examine it on the table. We have individual documents. We have individual pieces of evidence that signify what was going on. We can't put right now the United States on a table and analyze it. We have, a lot of evidence to signify what's going on here. if that makes any sense. I don't have to explain that too much more in some ways. But that's what I kind of mean. This overarching ideal, and then I've also, I think, referred to it as ideology. And ideology as the structures that allow us to make sense of the world. And whereas Christendom was that ideological overarching structure that allowed people to make sense of their world in the Middle Ages up through the early parts of the 16th century, the nation state became that. Whereby Christendom falls away, this ideology of the nation state takes its place. And that is what we see. And that would be leading to more conflict. Because the Reformation, even the outcomes that we talk about, didn't end religious conflict. It almost was the point of departure and platform for continued and further conflict. And here on this, I guess the third slide, the myth of the nation state, I have a series of further outcomes of what we see in terms of the Reformation of the 16th century pointing beyond. We have then here the 30 Years' War that was on the horizon, 1618 to 1648. In some ways, this is the 30 Years' War has been seen as the truly first World War. It's been also seen as a war that began as a war of religion and ended as a war of nations, because part of it was some of the powder keg that kicked it off was within the empire after the Peace of Augsburg. There was no place for Calvinists whatsoever. They were not allowed. And some of the conflicts came about when some of the princes started becoming Calvinistic. So don't we have a right to be part of the quote unquote toleration, the settlement? And the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 included within the empire Calvinist confessions. So we have Lutheran confession, Catholic confessions, and then Calvinist confessions. But this 30 Years' War was broader than that, and it really has been seen as a turning point again in Europe, as there's so many turning points in Europe. But again, that is beyond the period that we call of Reformation, because so much of again, using these labels, when we go into the 17th century, is often referred to as the age of absolutism. And so the 30 Years' War is beginning to seen as conflicts of absolute states, or the beginnings of conflicts of absolute states. Absolutism, as it was developing, in some ways was similar, if not, I'll say similar to my term of the myth of the nation state, a particular form of the myth of the nation state, where the nation state was seen as absolute. Again, cracking down on individual liberty and individual freedom. So often absolutism has been seen as epitomized by Louis XIV in France in his statement, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state. That kind of very personal identification, which goes back to the Carolingian kings of the Franks and Germanic kingdoms, who always view themselves as, "This is my personal realm." But yet, Louis is almost saying that not that France is me, but I am France. So that's kind of a different connection. And that couldn't have really come about without Henry IV and the developments of Henry IV, whereby there's a switch here. And French absolutism has been seen as the divine rights of kings. I know I've skipped the English absolutism, which I'll come back to in a second, even though I've referred to it before. As monarch, Louis XIV still felt, I got to make sure that the religion in my territory is the right one, because the slogan was "One king, one law, one faith." One king, one law, one faith. And my God, this Edict of Nantes, we have two faiths here. Louis, I think it's in 1687, revokes the Edict of Nantes. And France is saying we're still one law, one king, one faith, and that faith is Roman Catholicism. So there's controversy there. Louis kicks out the Jesuits too, which is always a fun thing. So there's all kinds of debates and conflicts going on. Of course, this is also the period of colonialization when the new nation states are trying to outdo the others in terms of wealth, in terms of power, in terms of world influence, because in this period, as we move from the 16th century, it's kind of beginning in the 16th century, but certainly as we get into the 17th century, Europe is looking outward, and this new world is there for our exploitation. That gets into a whole nother aspect that goes beyond the confines of the course on the Reformation, even though I would certainly argue that we can't understand what's going to be happening in the early modern world without understanding the Reformation in Europe, the European Reformations. But there's English absolutism, because again, in England, after the Elizabethan settlement, that was going to, as I've talked about it already, lead to the Civil War with the Puritans, and then the Puritans coming to the New World, and restoration of the monarchy. It didn't. The Reformation in England did not settle things, even with the Elizabethan Compromise. It did not put an end to conflict or religious dissension. It did not say, "Oh, everything is just a process of acceptance and toleration. Isn't this all grand and wonderful?" It is. It is the allowing for new conflicts to arise. So almost from conflict to conflict as we go through. Now, in Germany, in terms of settlements in Germany, the empire, we see the continued decentralization of the state, because the English state and the French state were becoming very strong absolute monarchies, which is simply a form of government, theoretically, that had already been argued for with the rise of papal monarchy sort of in the 13th century on in the 14th century. This idea that the Pope is absolute ruler, because the Pope is really for Christ, and no one can debate that Christ is the absolute ruler in an absolute sense. And no one would have in the 17th century either, at least early on in the 17th century. In the later 17th century, we begin for the first time to have find the self-designation of atheists. I am an atheist. Before that, we have the term atheist, but that was always used for your opponents who were wrong Christians. In the Roman Empire, going back early on, were referred to as atheists just because they did not believe in the Roman gods. So it was all an out-group term, a means to critique and slander your opponents. But in the later 17th century, it begins to say, yes, I am an atheist. But again, a different development. So we have this decentralized position in Germany. We have a decentralized position in Italy in terms of a nation state, because in Italy, too, is a series of city-states, and it have been all along. Italy and Germany aren't unified as political entities until the later 19th century, the 1870s. And so it is really an odd sense of development, where you have France and England being centralized states, and the principalities that comprise the empire and that comprise the Italian peninsula being decentralized, even though within the individual states, they still have the same issues of conformity and confessionalization. Even if Italy is the Council of Trent and it's the Counter-Reformation, because there are no Protestant city-states in Italy. Now, in Spain, so the golden age of Spain and the Netherlands, that is, the son of Charles V, Philip II, and who was reaping great loads of wealth from the New World, and also through his inheritance. We talk about the Spanish Netherlands, that led to what's called the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands today, when they kind of fused together, because they were independent principalities too. In the later medieval and 16th century, but they find the United Provinces is what they found to kind of counter Spanish influence. And so we have that war going on as the Dutch too then become great traders. And it's the golden age of Amsterdam in the 17th century, a wealth and flourishing. They've been centers of banking. So we have this real expansion of the world, at least of the European world, from a European perspective, of course, that was part of this Reformation. And along with that came the desire to win these souls that were being discovered in these new places for God, for Christ. So the missionary activity, we have the missionary activity combined with the economic greed for wealth and money and prosperity. And it's almost impossible to distinguish the two. We can say, well, those are contradictory. They weren't at the time. It was one and the same. Just as the Crusades, going back to the 11th and 12th centuries, were filled with greed. They're also, at least in their own minds, were based on sincere conviction of the need to defend other Christians from the infidel. And the infidel were enemies of Christ. So we go on crusade, we establish the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, we make ourselves very, very rich, but we're doing so for godly purposes. Those were not contradictory at the time, any more than they were in the 17th century. That's kind of the broad view of the various different patterns or outcomes stemming from the religious upheavals and the political upheavals of the 16th century. I'm getting to I have there the secularized state, whereby the state church was part of a state that itself was seen as worldly, which is not the same as saying not Christian. It's certainly Christian, but it was just part of the world. The saeculum, as it had always been, life in this world. The term saeculum, Augustine used for the period that we live in, temporality in this world. Of course, that is a temporary period for Augustine until we end up where we are as citizens of the city of God or the city of man, which is the hell. The saeculum is this period of time. And the secular, I've already talked about this, I believe, before. The secular priesthood were the priests who were, what we would call the normal, regular parish priests, whereas the regular priests were priests who were members of monastic orders or following the monastic rule. So the term saeculum and secular has a different meaning than is used today. To keep that in mind at the time. And the state is a secular state, yet one that is thoroughly based on confessionalized positions, and the state church is underneath the state, whereby in some ways we look back in the position of Marsilius of Padua in the 14th century in his Defensor Pacis of 1324, whereby the clergy are an essential function of the state, the Christian state, but not the ecclesiastical hierarchy, and that the ecclesiastical hierarchy should be done away with, but we need religion. We need the true religion. For Marsilius, Christianity is the true religion, and we need priests because they serve a function just as garbage collectors, just as soldiers, just as teachers. That almost becomes the model of the early modern state. That Marsilius position. I think I've already mentioned that in England, the advisors to Henry VIII, Thomas Cranmer and Cromwell, had kind of discovered Marsilius and were studying him and had him translated into English. Certainly, I don't know whether or not in France he was being studied, but my whole point being is that whether or not there was a direct link, as there was in England, that is the outcome that this secularized state was a state with state churches was going to be the norm going forward. And that then leads us to say, okay, if that is the outcomes, what were some of the major factors that led to this transition of Europe from medieval to early modern? And there I just have some points that I've been making all along. The close relationship between theology and history, whereby we can't understand the historical development without understanding the theological development. And we can't understand the theological development without understanding the historical development, because they're one and the same. From religionization to confessionalization. That's one of the things, too, I've stressed, that the Reformation of the later Middle Ages was based on religionization, the process or processes by which individuals were to become and express, to become religious. And at first, that being a religious meant entering the state of religion, and statu religionis, which meant entering a religious order. That, in the course of the 14th and the 15th century, began to expand. Whereas George Quedlinburg argued, every Christian should be a saint, and that you could be a religious without joining a monastic order. That concept of being a religious applies to everybody. Slowly developed in the 14th with Jordan is the first I've seen of it. With Jordan, then in the 15th century, and then with Luther becomes Luther's understanding of the priesthood of all believers, essentially. What we see, though, that Reformation, in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, was based on religionization. In the course of the 16th century, it becomes based on confessionalization, which I just gave you the definition earlier in this lecture, the process or processes by which a particular religious confession became inculcated as a means of territorial state building. I mean, I don't know if that's exactly word for word of what I have above, but it's close enough. And so those are two different models of Reformation. And we go from religionization to confessionalization. So that period of the 1520s, 1530s, when before 1529, we don't even have Protestants until 1529. Then that is this transition period when Europe is changing, but we don't know really where we are going to end up yet. And that's when we look at the whole picture. That's one of the things we see in general. It does not mean that religionization stops. It continues, and it continues not only within Europe and within also the Catholic Reformation, because that was what the Catholic Reformation continued to be based on, religionization. Even though with Trent and the Jesuits, it begins to have that confessionalized aspect to it, but it's still foundationally based on religionization. The New World, almost a new wave of Christianization, which had been the earliest process. Christianization of Rome, Christianization of the Germanic tribes, to about the year 1000. In the year about 1000, we see this beginning to be, okay, now that everyone's Christian, how do we make them truly Christian? The religionization process kind of begins. We go into the Reformation, and as outcome of the Reformation, we have the confessionalization process with the rise of state bureaucracy and state control and the absolute state and state churches. The world has been changing. We no longer, once we get to somewhere between 1555 and 1598, are no longer in a world that can be described as Christendom. It is early modern Europe. And early modern Europe is just a way of historians have said to say, this is different from the Middle Ages. It's not quite, though, completely like we are today. That's modern Europe. But it's closer to us than it was to the Middle Ages, so we'll call it early modern Europe. That's how artificial these terms are. They're not designations at the time saying that we were in early modern Europe. The same way that the term Reformation was an historical term being used for self-identification and calls for Reformation, as we have seen from the earliest parts of this course in the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. But confessionalization, early modern, we might think of ourselves as modern. I mean, modern was being used. There was appeals to modernity. It just means the now. We talk about the battle, the arguments, the debates, the conflicts between the ancients and the moderns in the 12th century. We can talk about the ancients and the moderns in the 14th century. And the moderns are always what? We're the newest and the best. And that just continues. And then it becomes finally applied to whole periods of history. And what it's trying to get at with all these labels is historical change. With kind of what I started with. How do we get from point A to point B? Again, the problem is simple. It's a very simple problem. Coming up with solutions or answers to it is the discipline of history. And as I argue and have argued, I think too explicitly in some of these lectures, history is the most difficult discipline we could study because it deals with everything. And it deals with human beings. And there are no right answers. There are good answers and there are bad answers. There are no right or wrong answers. And the same applies to your final exam, which I'll discuss shortly. But that kind of wraps up the lectures for this course. I mean, obviously, I'm going to be lecturing on the final exam, so that's technically a lecture too, but it's a different type. I hope this course has helped you conceive of things differently in terms of the Reformation. And that process, that, let's say, trying to force you to conceive of things differently, question what you had thought, has brought you to a new understanding. Even if it's a new understanding that is similar to your previous understanding, but one that is, I hope, deeper and more sophisticated and based on more historical developments and evidence than it had been previously. I've enjoyed this course a lot, actually. I mean, I always do, but in some ways, you guys have been a great group, and so I thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to reading your final exams. Now, as I turn to the final, I'll probably also be talking about conceptions because that's what the final exam is designed to get at. If we look at then the question, the final exam question, which I have up here, and I'm assuming you know it, but I'll just read it to you again. Was the Reformation, in its religio-theological, political, social, cultural, and intellectual aspects, a revolution? If so, how so? If not, how not? How should the transformation of European society and culture from medieval to early modern be best described? And that is in some ways the culmination of the lecture I just gave. I didn't go quite to that point. Was this a revolution? How do you go about answering this question for which there is no right answer and no wrong answer? There are good answers and bad answers. In some ways, you go about it the same way you've gone about answering the questions for the first midterm and the second midterm, relating concepts to details and presenting evidence based on the course material, the textbook, the assigned readings, and the lectures to support your argument for the position that you take. Whatever position you take, whether it is no, the Reformation was not a revolution, or yes, it was, you need to define your terms. What's the distinction between reform, Reformation, and then revolution? Historians, I mean, they have talked about it. Steve Osmond wrote a book on Reformation as Revolution. Friedrich Engels, the associate of Karl Marx, wrote a book on the German Peasants' War and called it the failed bourgeois revolution. There had the opportunity for a true revolution was there, but it didn't come about. So it's not, I'm not just throwing that term out for no reason. But at what point does Reformation become revolution? And how does that affect how we understand it? And if we don't define our terms, we don't really have a basis for providing a good answer, because then it's just throwing around inchoate terminology and ideas. So whatever position you take, define your terms, saying this is what I'm, for the purposes of this final exam, how I am defining reform. And for the purposes of this exam, this is how I'm defining Reformation. And for the purposes of this exam, this is how I'm defining revolution. Don't make them up. because the whole trick is to base your answer on the course material. Revolution, I haven't really talked about that much. I could have, but I want that to give that to you. I can say that in the 16th century, we find the first kind of use of the term revolution in terms of the publication of Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Celestium, the Revolution of the Heavens, published posthumously in 1543. So it's this turning about. Now, in 1543, and when Copernicus's ideas were first circulating in the 1530s already, very few people accepted them. Protestants and Catholics both dismissed Copernicus because it didn't make sense scientifically based on what they knew. And I think I may have mentioned this at some point in the lectures. This is getting at what the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn called, a paradigm change. And when a first idea is suggested that challenges the previous paradigm is going to reject it. And it takes a lot of time until there's this shift to a new understanding. That's a process. That is what we see with this transformation from medieval Christendom to the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. It's a change of paradigm. We see the same thing, not necessarily chronologically, but going on in terms of cosmology with Copernicus, and then it's not really being accepted until after Galileo in the 17th century. Copernicus wasn't condemned by the Pope at first. Copernicus wasn't condemned until 1619 when Galileo was condemned. The Pope, Copernicus sent his treatise to the Pope. The Pope even used it for calendrical reform. So there's a whole issues here of changing perspectives of the heavens and how the heavens work to, the European worldview of, oh my God, it's Asia. It's this new world that we didn't even know anymore. And we've always known about Asia. But we used to be called the expansion of Europe. There'd be courses in the expansion of Europe. That term has gone by the wayside because it's Eurocentric, and yes, it is. But from the Eurocentric position, that's what it was. Europe, the vision of Europe, of Christendom, was reaching outward to the entire world. And Emanuel Wallerstein talks about the world system, and that then pretty soon led to the issue of colonization and slavery. Very different from what had been. Was it a revolution? Was it a shift? Was it a change? Was it a reformation? Or was it simply reform? How do we define these terms, and what difference does it make? That is what I want you to address in your final essay, and to do so based on the course material. So it's not asking for your opinion out of nothing. It is saying, how do you organize and come to some understanding of the course material, the textbook, the lectures, and the readings? How do you conceptualize them and put them in order for an understanding? And what terms do you use to do so? And what is the basis for your choice of those terms to describe and label what you see? Now, again, the final is impossible to answer. The various aspects of social, the political, the religio-theological, the intellectual. Of course, the intellectual can deal with theology as well. But at least try to address more than simply religion, more than simply theology. Say, okay, in some ways, the Reformation was a revolution. It was, or at least provided the seedbed of revolution in terms of the scientific development with Copernicus, even if it had not been a revolution that was fully affected by that means. It was a revolution in terms of, social awareness, but it was a failed one with the Peasants' War. But the seeds were there. But you can't say, I would say it'd be difficult to argue that, and we see in the Reformation, the developing seeds that would lead to the overthrow of the feudal system. Why the feudal system was not overthrown until the French Revolution. because the three orders that were there, those who worked, those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked, were the three estates that had been voted were the voting blocks in the Estates Generale in what was the French Revolution, opposition to voting by estates. And the oath of the tennis court in 1789 was the saying, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to vote by representation. When members of the second estate joined with members of the third estate and got rid of the feudal legal structure. Jacques Le Goff talked about the long Middle Ages. We saw that. And for the majority of people, the majority of the population in Europe was still agrarian. And on the local agrarian level, not that much had changed. So if we say this is a reformation or a revolution, or even a reform, we have to ask, for whom was it that? For whom was it? Was it a reform and a reformation and revolution for women? It's also been argued that the Reformation was very much had a negative impact on women and on children too. I mean, it's like, whom are we talking about? Reformation for whom? That was Joan Kelly back in the early 70s, I think it was, published an article in terms of the Renaissance. Did women have a Renaissance? She basically said no. And I guess that for whom question depends on the perspectives that we're asking these things, these questions of. Was there a Renaissance? Well, yeah, but who was there a Renaissance for? Was there a Reformation? Yes, but whom was the Reformation for? So it's all these different aspects we have to take into consideration as we're coming to struggle with this question. How you do so is for you. I hope you struggle with it, but I also hope you have a lot of fun doing it. It's fun to struggle. I think it's fun to struggle. It's fun to say, what was it? Oh, I don't get it. And then really have to work towards it. Now yes, I get it now. The light bulb comes on. It's like, that works. And then defend your position. I have the historical argument. That document might be helpful to go back and review that document in course documents, historical argument in terms of presenting your case, because your final exam is going to be the case that you present to answer the question that's given you. And I'm the judge that's going to be sitting judging the case that you present. And that has to be both concepts in answering the question, as well as the evidence that you bring forward for your position. That's it in a nutshell. Again, I know it's maybe very a simple thing to say, but very complex to do. That I realize, like getting from point A to point B, that's the task of the historian, is a simple problem, but the doing so is infinitely complex. And my intent made this a complex question. It'd be easy for me to say, okay, I'm going to examine you on the following pieces of information. That's not what this course is about. That's not what education is about. That's just learning pieces of information. What do we do with them? How do we put them all together? What sense do we make of it? What meaning do we find in it? What understanding can we have? And that is an ongoing process. Your exam, I hope, your final exam, even if you knock it out of the park, I hope will not be the end point of your continuous to seek an understanding of the Reformation and what it means and what it meant. It's a never-ending process, history. It's a never-ending process coming to an understanding. Your exam, final exam, should be the case that you present based on the given point in time. Have fun with it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Email me. I'll answer as I can. I hope you all know it's due June 24th, which is a Saturday, 11:59 p.m. And I will be happy to discuss grades with anybody. I won't be able to discuss grades until after the submission of final grades. Um, Please note that your final grade in the grade book on Canvas um, may or may not be your final grade that I submit to the registrar. Your final grade that I submit to the registrar will not be lower than the grade in the grade book. That it could be higher, because what I do after I, you know, grade all the final exams, I'll look at the overall progress and come up with an overall grade. So if there has been, you know, progression from the first midterm, second midterm, and the final, that could, you know, bump you up some. Um, so anyway, just keep that in mind. But anyway, after I submit the final grades, I'll have to make uh, look up to see when final grade my submission is due. I'll happily meet with you. And if there's a problem, I can always go back and change your grade. That's not an issue. And I will always change it up if I've erred and given you what, in my evaluation, if you can convince me that I've given you too low of a grade, I'll go back and change it. If you come in and we go over things and then I kind of look at things again and think, gosh, no, I was too generous. You should actually deserve a lower grade. I will never go back to change a grade submitted to a lower grade. So it's to your benefit in some ways. Or if, as I said before, if you just want to, you know, contact me to chat about issues um, in more detail or in different ways, I'm certainly open to that too. I think that should about covers it for now. Again, if you have any questions, please do let me know. And have fun with the final. I wish all of you the best of luck, and I'm looking forward to reading them. I really am. And again, this has been the most enjoyable course for me. And so I thank you and wish you all the best. And I'll see you at some point, I hope. Take care and goodbye. Bye bye. Bye bye.